Our next speaker is Professor Yuval Shany. I'm sorry, Yuval, according to what I have here, you're still the Dean of the Law Faculty of the Hebrew University. So, a former Dean of the Law Faculty at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and Hersh Lauterpacht Chair in International Law. Professor Shany is also a member of the UN Human Rights Committee and a Vice President of Research at the Israel Democracy Institute. Professor Shany is an expert in international human rights law, humanitarian law, and he's studying the legal aspects of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. My question to you is the following. I think we heard from both Yuli and from Muhammad that the situation, the reality is quite bleak, mevaes in Hebrew, and I don't think we can solve all the problems, but at least with the tool, the legal tool that we have, the status, the legal status of human rights defenders and the protections afforded to human rights defenders, is it real? Is it something that is a dream, or is it something that has weight, that is practicable internationally and in Israel? Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, and I also like to welcome again the special rapporteur. So is it real? Yes, it is real. The question is it effective? I think, and this is I think, a very difficult question. Let me try and say a few words about how I understand the Institute of Human Rights Defenders, and I will say a little bit about my experience at the Human Rights Committee, which could partly answer maybe the question of is it real and is it effective, very partly. And then I'm going to say a few words about Israel. So I think it was an interesting comment by Zedan on the comparative constitutionalism that we are seeing. We are seeing, in the past we used to look comparatively in order to strengthen human rights protection and use best practices, but it has flipped. This is true. So the resolution, I would say that the 53/144, the Human Rights Defenders Declaration, does have three rationales. There are three reasons why human rights defenders merit special international protection. So I think one element is very simple. Expressing our views or creating an association which is designed to promote human rights is part of our basic freedoms, like any other freedoms. So this is so when human rights defenders speak out, they are exercising first and foremost the freedom of speech. And when human rights defenders are creating an association to promote human rights, they are upholding their freedom of association. So first of all, and I think it is important that human rights defenders' rights are human rights. This is, I think, has to be the starting point of the discussion. But it is true, and Shai, who made the introduction and referred to the Georgian activist and the notion that, well, can we say, is it proper for us to say that human rights defenders are more valuable than ordinary people's, that human rights defenders' rights are more valuable than ordinary, so to speak, human beings' rights? And I think there are two things to say in this regard which are important, and that is that, well, maybe they're not more important, but human rights defenders are often in many countries in a much more vulnerable situation than other individuals. So they are they are and they should be on watch lists for people who care about human rights and care about preventing violations. So they are among, they're not the only subcategory in this group of vulnerable individuals, but they are vulnerable individuals because what they do is, as we have heard, is an anathema to the powers in place. And thirdly, and this is the trickiest issue, and this is the instrumental value of the work of human rights defenders. So it's not that only they exercise their own rights, but they facilitate the enjoyment of the rights of others. So if governments want to limit human rights, it's a very effective way for them to target human rights defenders and other what we call gatekeepers. So and the reverse side of the coin is that if we want to protect human rights, we have to protect human rights defenders and gatekeepers. So in that respect, it's not that the rights or the individuals are more vulnerable, but the rights, when you think strategically about human rights promotion, the rights of human rights defenders are particularly important. So moving on to the perspective of a treaty body such as the Human Rights Committee, this is something which the Human Rights Committee is very focused on and encounters quite frequently in bad states, so to speak, but also in reasonably good states. You see situations where human rights defenders are being either shamed or delegitimized, but sometimes really suffer very immediate danger. And this sort of concern has led the committee to take on some structural initiatives, such as appointing a special rapporteur on reprisals, that is paying special attention to violations against those human rights groups and individuals who are suffering reprisals because they cooperate with international bodies, but also pay special attention when reviewing country situations to the situation of human rights defenders. So very quickly, just 3 examples from the last 2 years. The Human Rights Committee reviewed a few months ago the situation in Honduras, and has made a special, has voiced special concern about the killing of a well-known indigenous rights activist, Berta Cáceres. The committee called on the state to provide effective protection to human rights defenders, to set up a mechanism to investigate violence and threats, to collect statistics on crimes against human rights defenders. Is this effective? We will see. Probably not in the short term. In the long run, it does convey the message indicated before, that yes, I mean, the country knows that this is an issue which gets particular international attention, and it may act more carefully, may. Azerbaijan is another country the committee reviewed last year, and where you see human rights defenders, especially lawyers in that country, being harassed for representing clients who make human rights allegations. So there we see actually very sophisticated ways to get lawyers out of the way, to disbar them, so to initiate legal proceedings against lawyers for defaming the state, and then getting the Bar Association to disqualify them as lawyers. You see there also a very interesting technique of summoning lawyers as witnesses in cases, and by virtue of the criminal proceeding rules, disqualifying them from representing, and of course filing trumped-up charges against human rights defenders. In the interest of time, I will not continue with this, but I will just say that I think it's beyond doubt that human rights defenders are subject increasingly to persecution and to adverse treatment. And I think one could speak in this regard about 3 stages that you see on a global stage, but also here. I think you see stage 1, delegitimization, the creation of an atmosphere that makes it illegitimate to work as a human rights defender. So just to give you a very brief example, in Venezuela, apparently, the Speaker of the House has a TV show, which he is free to express his views. So after an NGO appeared before the Human Rights Committee, this was an item on the TV show in which the Speaker of the House did recommend what he called the false patriots that go on and badmouth the country internationally. So this is stage 1. The stage 2 that we are seeing are attempts to act to restrict the work of human rights defenders, to create obstacles in the work of human rights defenders. And stage 3 is really getting the human rights defenders out of the way, disbarring their associations, threatening their lives, and in some countries even killing them. I think the definition is something that is worth perhaps saying 2 words. There is no clear definition of what are human rights defenders. And I think this is one of the virtues, this is one of the strengths of the resolution. The fact that we do not have a closed list of professions or of ad hoc functions that would qualify human rights defenders. We need, however, to confront the reality that this is sometimes also a problem in protecting the interests of human rights defenders, because whereas sometimes it's quite clear that an individual is being targeted for human rights work, especially when someone is a professional human rights defender, there are trickier cases where states are trying to push theories that persons have been arrested not because they have engaged in human rights activism, but because they were participating in a violent demonstration. And there, especially for international bodies with very limited fact-finding capacity, this is sometimes a problem. So concluding with some remarks on the situation here in Israel. So I think I fully agree with the previous speakers that noted that what we are seeing in Israel is, with regard to human rights defenders, cannot be dissociated from what we are seeing in Israel more generally with regard to human rights. And the idea that human rights serve as a restriction on the power of the majority to get all of its wishes. And it's not only in Israel, but I think in Israel this has been changing very quickly and very dramatically in recent years. And it is true that the anti-human rights defenders is part of a broader campaign against all other gatekeepers and all other mechanisms that constrain political power. We have seen here, I think, certainly stage 1 and stage 2, but from what we heard from you, stage 3 is in the offing. So we are seeing the attempts to delegitimize the work of NGOs. We've seen the issue of foreign governments not being put forward as a sophisticated way to insinuate that human rights groups are actually working to serve the interests of foreign governments. We have seen a recent attempt to brand human rights or a human rights organization as liars. And we have seen in something which is in between stage 1 and 2, an attempt to basically boycott events in which government officials are working with human rights groups. We had last week the conference with ACRI that was canceled. This is not only a question about delegitimizing, having the Minister of Education instructing the ministry not to cooperate with a group which is pro-terrorist, allegedly, but also it actually complicates the ability of a human rights group like ACRI to actually engage with state officials with a view to implement its mandates. So these are very difficult developments. So I think, and I think, of course, not all animals are equal in this regard. Some human rights groups are much more hurtful for the government, much more hateful. And I think breaking the silence is in a way hitting a very raw nerve. And this is perhaps why it is getting an exceptionally bad treatment from government. Combination of former soldiers and activity outside the country is really, this is a perfect storm for the existing government. So I think it is beyond question that what we're seeing here doesn't meet neither the letter or the spirit of the Human Rights Defenders Declaration. I would argue that that declaration is not just a human rights resolution, which is a recommendation. It is actually today a part of customary international law, and I think it is an indispensable element in the interpretation of the treaties, of the various human rights treaties. For the Human Rights Committee, the protection of human rights defenders is part of the duty of states to implement the human rights obligations. There is also, do we have a minute or two? There is also a stage 4, and I will just say on this 2 sentences, and maybe stage 4 is I think there is a question as to whether, in order to fulfill their functions, human rights defenders need exceptional additional rights that ordinary citizens do not have. Michael knows that we have had with Breaking the Silence the issue of the testimonies and the immunity that was claimed. I had the privilege of being part of the amicus brief that was filed here to the court, arguing that a human rights group like Breaking the Silence are entitled to the same immunities that journalists have vis-a-vis their sources. So this is perhaps something that it's not clear whether this is fully captured within the declaration, but I would definitely argue that it should be. And in the interest of time, I will not speak about funding to government funding to certain NGO, which is actually best practice the good practice that we are seeing in some countries, but it's really light years away from here.